So for your third mini lecture, I want to stress the importance of longitudinal studies in lifespan development. So what is a longitudinal study? That's when you are following the same people across time. And in contrast to a cross-sectional sample, this provides a better representation of growth or change, development, maturation. So let me give you an example. Say we were interested in comparing children who were 2, 4, 6, and 8 years old. So if we collected data all at once, say in the year 2000, then we're trying to say how these different ages are different, but we are using different people to make that comparison. And this is when we worry about cohort effects. So our 2-year-olds were born in 1998, our 4-year-olds were born in 1996, our 6-year-olds were born in 1994, and our 8-year-olds were born in 1992. Now, what if there was something critically different about these cohorts? Maybe parenting shifted slightly. There was a critical event, something that made them inherently different based on the cohort they were in and not just related to their age. So, what would be a better approach? If we collected the same individuals born in 1998 and in 2000 we did an assessment, and then again in 2002 we did the same assessment, 2004 and 2006, then we can see how these individuals are changing across time. So this is why this is the most important design for developmental psychologists. As a reminder, this is one of your essay options. We talked about Baltus's lifespan approach and his 7 key principles of lifespan development. We discussed why it's important to do longitudinal studies to assess these different important components of lifespan development. So let me give you an example of a longitudinal study that I was a part of. This is the longest longitudinal study that I have been a part of. In fact, it started when I was in middle school. So when I got to grad school in 2003, at that time, I believe we were on the 14-year assessment. So this was a longitudinal study of adolescent mothers and their children. It began when the mothers were pregnant with their kids, and then they interviewed the moms when their kids were 1, 3, 5, 8, 10, 14, and 18 years. They also started interviewing the kids when the kids were 8, 10, 14, and 18 years. So let's draw in some of the vocabulary that we talked about in mini lecture 1. First off, we need to consider, is this a large enough sample size? So for this to truly be representative of a population, do we have an adequate sample size? Well, this is an important issue in longitudinal studies, and that's attrition. We started with over 300 mothers, which was definitely an adequate sample size, but by 18 years, we had a large amount of attrition, which is when people drop out of the study. And this could be because we lost touch with them, they moved, it could be due to death or just disinterest in the study. And because of that, this is why we ended the study. It would have been great to follow up on the kids one more time when they were in their early 20s, but we didn't feel like the sample size would have been adequate to truly provide a good representation. Another way we can critique the study is was there evidence of random selection from the population? So if we're going to generalize to all teen moms, is this a good a sample? And we do need to keep in mind that these teen moms were in South Bend, Indiana. So this is a smaller town in northern Indiana, and their experiences and their outcomes are likely different than mothers, say, in rural areas or in inner city Chicago. So we do take our results with caution, that is a limitation of the study. Now, important takeaway message is longitudinal studies are very expensive and they take quite a bit of effort. So even though we only had 100 people at 18 years, there was a lot of effort put into getting those 100 people. For this project, we of course used standardized measures. We did surveys that were administered to the mothers and their children. These were psychometrically validated measures, so they were standard, they were valid, reliable. We also had some objective assessments that were implemented by the researchers. I participated in some of these. I did some IQ tests for the 18-year-olds. We also did a maternal IQ test when the mothers first started this study. We did child assessments across time, being sure that these kids were on task, that they were hitting the milestones they were supposed to. And these were across all developmental domains. So we were figuring out if they were cognitively, physically, and psychosocially on task. Here's an example of a standardized measure that was used. This is called the Youth Inventory. It was 113 items. That's pretty long. It was administered at the 18-year assessment to the children. And this is able to identify 13 disorders that are on the DSM Axis 1. So this is the diagnostic and statistical manual that you learned about in Intro to Psych and Abnormal to Psych. This can be administered to 12 to 18-year-olds, and after they take this, you can see it's on a Likert scale from never to very often. Then we can get an indication if they likely have a diagnosis of ADHD, depression, anorexia, etc. Here is an example of dissemination. I published this article looking at maternal depression and child behavior. Now, those fancy words, transactional relationship with simultaneous bidirectional coupling, what does that mean? It means that we're looking at both how maternal depression impacts child behavior and child behavior impacts maternal depression. And I bring that up because it's really important to consider that longitudinal studies are correlational studies. We can't randomly assign in this example, mothers to be teen moms or not. So often when we're following people over time, we're looking descriptively at what's going on, and we're able to get a really good understanding of these processes through some advanced statistics, but you've all heard that correlation does not imply causation. And this means that while our hypothesis is that mothers who score higher on maternal depression are more likely to have children with more behavior problems, we can't say whether it's the mother's depression that causes the child behavior, or perhaps children who are behaving poorly impact their mother's depression. Now, some reminders on correlations. You need to assess correlations in both direction and magnitude. So a positive correlation means that your two variables are moving in the same direction. So mothers who, the higher they are on maternal depression, the more the behavior problems are. A negative correlation could be an example of mothers who are higher on maternal depression have lower social support. So is it because they have lower social support that they're more depressed, or is it because they're more depressed that somehow perhaps they're pushing people away and have lower social support? You also need to look at the magnitude. So a correlation that is close to 1 or close to -1, those would be considered perfect correlations where there's a 1-to-1 correspondence. So a 1-point increase in depression would lead to a 1-point increase in child behavior. Now, perfect correlations are pretty impossible in psychological research, and in fact correlations with a magnitude of 0.8 are considered quite high. We'd probably see correlations closer to 0.3 or 0.4. Now, why is that? It's because there's a lot going on. If we're trying to predict maternal depression, we not only have to consider child behavior, but things like the mother's income, their relationship status, their genetic predisposition to depression. So there's lots of predictors, meaning if we just looked at one aspect like behavior problems, it's not explaining everything that's going on. Correlation of 0 means that there's no relationship between the two variables. So say variable X, which could be maternal depression, and variable Y, which is child behavior. So here's your exam question. How would you interpret a correlation of 1.8? And I hope some of you were sort of confused when I asked that, because if you calculated a correlation of 1.8, then you miscalculated it. I told you that correlations have to be a perfect positive correlation is 1, a perfect negative correlation is -1, so all correlations will be between positive 1 and negative 1. If you got something greater than 1 or less than negative 1, then it's a mistake. So that's something important to remember about correlations. So this wraps up everything you need to know for longitudinal studies for exam 1. Please watch your final mini lecture now on experimental designs.